Welcome back, MTG Joe here. Today we are going to look at the weekly metagame breakdown for Standard Best of One. We're going to look at the top performing decks, highest win rate, the best decks in Standard up to Mythic rank. This weekend is also the metagame challenge. So Standard metagame challenge, you get to compete to win up to 30 free packs if you get to 7 wins before you get a loss. Very fun event. Usually heavily go into every one of the metagame challenges, provided you have some reps with decks. Pretty easy way to try to farm some packs. So we're going to take a look at a number of viable options this month. So we're going to get the data predominantly from Untapped GG. We have a couple decks from MTGO leagues, stuff like that we'll factor in. But if you want to use Untapped to track your win rates, see some standard decks, the link is in the video description. But I'll paste all these deck lists as well in a consumable format so you can easily import it to your heart's content. So kind of prefacing, it's early in the month. We're going to look at Diamond. We're going to see which kind of subset of decks are kind of pushing. There's going to be decks that you could probably win with most tier 2 decks in Standard, but obviously the outlier in terms of consistently winning at a high enough win rate with some of the other decks may vary over time. So these are the decks of the week. So take a look, see what you think. If you are kind of succeeding with another deck, do let me know in the comments. Always curious to see what folks are having the most success with. So in terms of popularity, so this is metagame distribution, the volume that you'll see a deck. Not necessarily it's winning, but just people like playing. Mono red is at 18%, kind of surpassing Gruul in terms of the red-based aggro decks. With an uptick of domain from past weeks, mono red kind of combats it. You kind of have a 3-horse race. Bounce is very good against mono red. Domain's good against bounce. Mono red's good against domain. So you kind of have self-contained ecosystem there of decks fighting each other. From there, you have Azorius Control, kind of wrapping it in 4th. Gruul Prowess at 5%, Oculus at 5%. Goblins decks picking up popularity, but not doing too well. And then Boros Mice is at 2%. There's a couple of Boros decks that like 5-0'd recently on MTGO as well. So we'll take a look at an example there. At the end, I'm going to show 2 decks as well. Probably not the most well-known, highest volume of games, but some folks have had some early success with it up to Mythic rank, so we'll highlight a couple of those decks as well. In terms of the week, February 26th through to the 5th, so a little bit of the overlap at the end of the month, 23,000 games played. Mono red also happens to be the highest win rate. This particular version's at 80%. What we have is the deck starting to adopt some number of Soulstone Sanctuaries. It is a mouse. It is a spirit for Nemesis. It doesn't really matter, but it's a mouse for the package, so you can get a double strike trample, which is nice. It gives you in the grindier matchups another way to kind of sink your mana, add to the board without committing more in terms of that. Otherwise, it's a pretty stock list. Some of the lists are starting to adopt some number of Sunspine links in the main. So depending on how you want to attack the meta, that is a call that has been done in some cases. Seen usually 2 Sunspine main, 2 in the side. So something to kind of consider there. If you're running into a lot of domain, that's a card you can bring in to help out that matchup. So pretty stock list otherwise. You see 3 Sunspine in the side. Urbrass Forge is a card that's kind of been dropping off in some of the sideboards. Just given that the white decks usually play Authority of the Consoles. It can be bounced, stuff of that. So this has seen a little bit decrease in play over Sunspine links coming in to replace it. Lithomantic Barrage is maybe a card you want to play a couple more copies of, useful in those like against Oculus, Sheltered by Ghost style matchups, stuff like that. Hazards for the kind of the Convoke matchup, probably not something enough on Arena to warrant the play. You might just want the other torch. You can play Obliterating Bolt. So there's some flexible cards in the sideboard you may want to consider there. Moving on, we have Boros Mice, 73%. So elements of the mouse package that we see, but you're also playing a couple copies of Mabel, Anthem for your mice, as well as creating a legendary artifact that gives Vigilance, Trample, Haste. So very strong kind of effect there. Within white, you get access to Lightning Helix, removal that gains you life, as well as burn to the face, some Sheltered by Ghosts, removal, life gain, and then you have Shard Mage Rescue as some protection effects, but otherwise very similar to the mono red deck. Some Restless Biovacs. You can use the new, if you want to kind of tailor this mana base. The list I saw online was only playing 1 Biovac, and then it was playing a full set of the new Verges. So that's something you can kind of consider in terms of updating if you want more untapped dual lands in the deck that allow you to kind of trim the number of planes and just play mountains consistently. We have Lynxes for the bigger mana domain decks. Also reasonable against Pixie since they play all non-basics. You have Screaming Nemesis for the red-based mirrors, Rest in Peace for Graveyard Hate, Destroy Evil. The big thing with adding white, you get access to kind of kill bigger things as well as Enchantment Hate. And then you have your Barrages and Torches in here. Moving on, we go to Jeskai Oculus. So 67% on this one. This deck can kind of go a couple different ways. Some of them, you might see like the odd monument list. There's some Boros decks that are just splashing blue for a Horn Oculus. This one here I think is a little bit more consistent. You just play kind of a draw go style effect. You have things like Prophecydetic Memory that just supercharges any of your creatures. So you can make any creature really a threat. Steamcore Scholar, for example, comes in on curve, and then it draws you 2 cards, so it becomes a 4/4 Vigilance. You also have the kind of Helping Hand, Recommission effects to get back your Oculus. You have Looting with like Bitter Reunion. This can be Mako instead if you want. I've seen some lists even play Heartfire Hero. It's just kind of an alternative there. There's a lot of kind of like flex spots in this. This is, I believe, the version from the Pro Tour that is playing. You have your like disruptive elements. You have Chandra on the side. Anytime they kind of attack the graveyard, gives you another angle of attack. Brotherhood's End, Sweeper that can also deal with artifacts. Filigree Silex can deal with hate pieces. Scales can deal with lower drops. Kind of a pseudo, well, it is kind of a pseudo Ratchet Bomb, just kind of a slightly different effect, or typing and wording. Oil counters instead of just regular counters. Fireclasm for the go wide decks. Negates for kind of cheap counters for sweepers. Destroy Evil, and then Ghost Vacuum for Graveyard Hate. Disdainful Stroke might be also something you want to consider in these decks. Against the big mana decks like Zur Domain, it hits pretty much all their meaningful things. We have Esper Pixie, so Esper Bounce. This deck here is one of the many that is playing the This Town Ain't Big Enough, as well as Storm Chaser's Talent combo. Pick up, drop the same things over and over. Hopeless Nightmare shreds your opponent's hand. Your Isolation can rebuy that. You can rebuy some removal. You have Momentum Breaker in here. Edict that can also force discard. This version is on a Defiled Crypt that can let you rebuy stuff, pick it up. So just bring things back over and over again from your graveyard. And then Kaido is kind of a non-creature element of attack, very strong on curve to cheat out. You have Optimistic Scavenger that can put a bunch of counters on your stuff and make them very, very strong. Temporary Lockdown is actually an interesting one against the think against like mono red, the aggressive decks. While it does hit a lot of your permanents have ETBs, so you can pick it up your Temporary Lockdown with this town or any of your bounce effects. Your stuff has ETBs, like the Mice stuff doesn't really have ETB, and then you get to reset all those, cast Lockdown again, and lock them down. Lauren, Artifact Enchantment Hate, Graveyard Hate, cheap counters, reasonable against like the big mana decks. Even sometimes I've had it brought in against me against mono red. Or Gruul, kind of hits you on curve. Destroy Evil for bigger stuff, enchantments, Spell Pierce, cheap disruption, and Grim Bauble as cheap removal for the aggressive decks. We have then Dimir Midrange. So this version here is not on the bounce package. There are some that are Dimir Bounce that do have some elements of the bounce package. The midrange list was a little bit higher this week than the bounce version. You have just a bunch of cheap disruption, cheap removal kind of mixed in, Spell Stutters, Fairy Masterminds, draw you cards when your opponent's draws, Blood Pit's Drowner taps down your opponent's stuff, Fey Bloom Trick as a way to tap down your opponent's stuff as instant speed, give you some bodies, reasonable blockers, Tidebinder for activated abilities, really good against like Domain, Curiosity draws you cards, Kaido kind of runs away the game, some Soul Stones in the base. The mirror mana base is cleaner, isn't as painful. Pixie gives you some more flexible tools for like enchantments, stuff like that. You have Sweepers with Gix Command. Against like some decks, you can just shift up a little bit more mid-rangey. Against like me being a Gruul player, I often see Preachers, Shieldreds come in against me. Tashana can be reasonable against things like Urbrass Forge from the aggro decks, or like Jace out of your opponent, stuff of that nature. Deluge is a sweeper, more cheap removal, some hand hate, some cheap counters, and graveyard hate. We have Zur Domain, 61%. So a lot of these lists are adopting a lower curve for their sweepers. So Day of Judgment as well as Temporary Lockdown coming in, just allowing you to interact with your opponent's board earlier. Analyze the Pollen early game can help you hit a basic land, and then late game helps you tutor for Zur or any of your key pieces. A lot of the decks are adopting Ride's End into the main now. It's a 2-mana removal spell for a tapped creature or vehicle, mainly creature, but notably at exile, so against things like Heartfire Hero or things that might come back from the graveyard, you have the exile effect there. Otherwise, you have your Overlord package, Ley Lines, and you just kind of went through Zurs. Your sideboard, Nissa for the mirror, if you do happen to run into like Caretaker's Talent decks, which haven't been around that much. Atraxa can be brought in as another threat in the Grindier matchups. Elish Norn for the mirror. Against heavy discard decks, you have your Bailots. Beza for like the mid-rangey matchups, the aggressive decks. Stock up in the Grindier matchups, just give you some card advantage. Graveyard Hate, Enchantment Hate, Flyer Hate with Paw Patch. Negates for cheap counters, and Elspeth's Smite as a cheap removal option. Gruul Aggro, so Gruul Prowess. So this deck here, 60%. Numbers you'll see some varied. I've seen anywhere between 1 to 3 Paw Patch. I really like this card, well, not in most. Lets you kind of put some pressure, could be multiple bodies, helps in that respect. I do like Questing Druid for some card advantage, and Keeper's Talent as a way to repeatedly trigger Valiant, make you really big creatures, as well as just be a mana sink if you do end up flooding some games. You do have the nice interaction. Innkeeper can target Emberheart every turn to be basically a Valiant trigger for some card advantage. 3 Screaming Nemesis, 1 Sentinel. Some of these decks are having varied numbers of Sentinels. The reason being 3/4, very good against Nowhere to Run, can put some pressure on your opponent. In the mirrors, offense, defense, as well as the map tokens are another way to trigger Valiant for your creatures. You'll also see some Soulstone Sanctuaries in the mana base. Witch Stalker for bigger stuff, kind of, you're not playing as many as mono red in the main. You have Sunspine for the domain matchups. Heavy discard decks, you have Baloth, Sentinel, again for just like the Esper Pixie matchups, these would come in. Pyroclasm, your opponent's really low to the ground, tokens decks, stuff like that. Convoke, if you run into it, you have Pyroclasm, you can shift up to just kind of Gruul midrange. Also, some of your creatures have Prowess, so it can kind of dodge it that way. Paw Patch, again, Enchantment Hate, Flyer Hate, some various removal options, and then Ghost Vacuum for Graveyard Hate. We have Golgari Self-Mill, so our Golgari Graveyard. This one's at 56%. So this deck is looking to fill your yard. So you have things like Sinout Scout, Gnawing Vermin, Molt Tender can mill you and be mana. You have Beanstalk that draws off any of these cards. So things like Chitian Gravestalker cost 1 less for each creature. Hollow Marauder, Huskbuster, the Overlord, even just casting the Impending, both fills your graveyard to reduce these costs. And then also is a way to trigger Beanstalk, Overwhelming Remorse as a 1-mana removal spell that exiles. You have Harvester as removal as well. So just a bunch of ways to kind of go with that. Souls of the Lost can scale over the game as well. So you're a little soft, obviously, to Graveyard Hate. A lot of the cost reductions come up that way. Post board, you have Full Floor Scrap Shooter, as well as Haywire Might for Graveyard Hate. You have Terror Tide that can be a sweeper based on the number of permanents in your graveyard. Another Harvester is kind of an Edict effect. Starving Revenant as a way to kind of give you some card advantage. Cheap removal, Duresa's Hand Hate, and then against the discard decks, you have Baloth in addition to it. Good against like game 1 with Pixie. If they're going to force you to discard a lot of stuff, you don't actually mind. Izzet Prowess, so a deck we don't see too often. It's just a shade under 55, so no this town package, but it's got elements of the more prowessy red builds, so Slick Shot seeing play again, Emberheart Challenger, Monastery Swiftspear. You have Bolt Wave as burn, Burst Lightning as burn, Mockingbird can copy any of your other creatures, giving Emberheart flying is very powerful. You have Monstrous Rage, 8 cantrips, and then Storm Chaser's Talent, which makes another prowess creature. Big thing for this deck's viability is the River Spire Verge, just giving you another untapped tool. Cheap removal and torch, cheap disruption and spell pierce, shore up. Now notably, the hexproof against like Nowhere to Run and stuff is not the best, but it gives a bonus and a lot of your creatures can outscale. +1 plus the prowess a lot of times can scale them out. Barrage is cheap removal, and then against some bigger stuff, just bounce off. Tempoing them off if they're playing like a 3-drop, a 4-drop, a 5-drop, bouncing it to hand to get you an attack in, or just setting them back a full turn when all your spells cost 1 or 2 is very strong. Then we have Golgari Fight Club. This deck's saw some play at the Pro Tour, always kind of a popular thing for folks. Phyrexian Obliterator with effects like Bushwhack that lets you fight and force your opponent to sack. I actually had a hilarious game where I was on Gruul. My opponent in a game fought me twice, but I had such a wide board with tokens and stuff that I managed to survive 2 Obliterator fights, just sacking down to lands, and just a funny game to like win. But yeah, if you're a red deck, you see this, you get scared. A bunch of cheap removal, cut downs, go for the throats, pulses, anoints, and then even things like Harvester on the top end. Card advantage with Mosswood, Sentinels in here, as well as Preachers for some card advantage. Another deck that got access to a Verge in its mana base. In the grindier matchups, when the Obliterator really doesn't have text against Domain, heavy removal mirrors, bounce mirrors, you do have access to Unholy Annex for some card advantage, so you can shift into more traditional mid-range. Sweepers, discard, Archfiend, again, just gives you a different angle of attack. Archfiend can close out games very quickly, unlike the Obliterator. And then Frillback, Artifact Enchantment, Graveyard Hate, Sweeper. This can get rid of Sunfall, Zurs, Omniscience, stuff like that in various combo decks. Terra Sunder, Artifact Enchantment Hate, and the rest as Hand Hate. So I apologize for the ads. I gotta find a new ad blocker. They just blocked uBlock. So if anyone has a suggestion, let me know. But this is Azorius Control that's been popping up in leagues. This one's from Seraph J. But this was pretty much the Pro Tour list. Beza's, Hornlock Whale, Overlord of the Mistmoors as your creature package. Bunch of cheap counters and removals, Change, Equation, Get Lost, No More Lies, Ride's End, Negates. And then stock up the big card here, 3 mana, kind of the curate effect. These control decks were lacking a true card advantage engine. We lost Memory Deluge. You're not playing Beans in these decks, so it gives you that kind of answer. Sunfall, Day of Judgment, and Temporary Lockdown in here. And then your win condition. Predominantly Jace along with the creatures, very good against the domain decks, just mill them out that way there. You have Beza's kind of to help you stabilize against the discard decks, Wiltleaf Liege and Obstinate Baloth. This can gain you some life. I do think like Liege at least is castable in this deck. I understand you can potentially make treasures through your fountain ports. Just think this is a little bit more castable, but that was this kind of split at the Pro Tour. The section tools is a lifelink body. You can sack the tokens from Fountain Port to kind of re-equip it. Graveyard Hate, Overlord for just the mid-rangey matchups, kind of shift up and then close the game out faster. Authority for like hasty decks. Shauna's Tidebinder for the mirrors. Any sort of heavy like triggered abilities or activated abilities. And then Devout Decree. This one is an answer to a Result Kaido, all the red cards, stuff of that nature. Soul Guide Lantern and Graveyard Hate. We then have Omni combo, so a lot of kind of ways to win the game with this, but the combo is fairly, establishing it is fairly similar. This version is from Cown. They went 5-0 on MTGO. So you mill your deck. Balaji, this one's got Oracle of Tragedy. That lets you draw this card. Can also shuffle back cards if needed. Moment of Truth, Confounding Riddle, Charter Course. This one's playing some stock ups. Core of the deck, what you're looking to do is have Omniscience in your graveyard. You cast Abuela's Awakening, you put it into play. Then you Invasion of Arcavios. So this version is a little bit different. Some of them will play the Black Tutor. Skipping my mind now. Not Beseech the Queen. Beseech the Mirror. I always say Beseech the Queen. But Beseech the Mirror, then you get a second copy of Invasion. You go into your sideboard, you get This Town Ain't Big Enough. And then you start bouncing invasions back and forth with your win condition spell, which in this case is Haunt the Network. You can do Baroque Reinforcements, Preach the Multiverse. There's a lot of different options here. This one will just let you win by draining them out. Gain and drain over and over again. This version here is using Johann's Stopgap, so you keep bouncing your Invasion of Arcavios, drawing cards, and then this will allow you to eventually draw into the second copy. From there, you can This Town, the Invasions, back and forth. You get the Haunt the Network, and then kind of cast it that way there. Post board, you have access to Riptide Gearhulk, just another kind of win condition. When this enters, for each opponent, put up to 1 target non-land permanent, third from the top. So you could also just keep bouncing this over and over again if you want, as a way to just get rid of their entire board. I was reading, like when the person posted this, it's good against Pixie. It is still just a 5-mana 2/5, but again, you can just kind of shift what you want. As a post board, if they're heavy graveyard hate, you can play Jace or something like that. Grand Abolisher helps against the various counter spells, things at instant speed. Then you have temporary lockdown, and Day of Judgment, and then some negates and disenchants for graveyard hates. So 2 decks from folks. So this one is green-white counters from Kiev Minor. They went 33 and 19 into 184 Mythic. So this deck here is playing a counters deck. So working for this one person, always kind of preface with that. I haven't played this deck, not fully sure, but it's got some of the elements of the survival mechanic. You also have a number of ways to saddle. District Mascot comes in with counters. When you saddle, it gets more counters and it can destroy an artifact. Paw Patch distributes counters. The Veteran Survivor's Graveyard Hate and can kind of scale up in power. You have Voyager Glide Car, way to tap your things, kind of pseudo convoke. You have Bulwark Ox, 2-mana 2/2. When it attacks while saddled, you put a counter on target creature. Then you get sacrifice to give your creatures hexproof and indestructible. Lagarin, basically if it gets saddled when it attacks, you can put 1/1 counters on up to 2 creatures. Miriam, as long as it's your turn, mounts and vehicles you control have hexproof, and whenever a mounted creature you control attacks, you put a 1/1 counter. So a lot of ways kind of just use these mount effects with counters. Reluctant Role Model gets counters when it gets tapped. Sheltered is removal. Putzil is kind of a Grand Abolisher effect, and then you get to draw some cards. Tumbleweg puts counters on things. The Velocipede doubles up counters. Wily Duke draws you cards. So some card advantage engines, lots of ways to kind of take advantage of more counters. And then I have no clue what this card does. Caradora, Heart of Alcrea. 4-mana 4/2. Search your library for mounted vehicle, and then if 1 or more counters. Okay, so it's just another kind of double up counter style effect. You can have Cavernous Souls. I assume most of these are humans. You can also name Mount if you'd like, so some flexibility of what you can name there. Wilt Leaf for the discard deck. Split Up as Sweeper for these kind of go wide creature mirrors. Even with all the tap effects, it's good because you can tap your stuff down if their stuff's untapped, so you have some flexibility there. Haven Interrupter for Sunfall Sweeper style effects along with the invasions. The Skyseer's Chariot, you could just name like Sunfall or something like that. Rest in Peace for Graveyard Hate. Paw Patch for Enchantment Hate. Mold Adler, reasonable effect against like the Pixie decks, stuff like that. The Dimir decks, and then Elspeth Smite for the creature mirrors. And then lastly, we have Rakdos Sacrifice 23 and 8 by Carrid. They got to 130 Mythic. So this deck here, again, quite a few ways to build these decks, but the core of it is leveraging Disturbing Mirth to sacrifice cheap enchantments for kind of card advantage. You have things like Hopeless Nightmare, the Nowhere to Run, the Roll token. You have then Forge is just a repeatable damage source in the main board. A lot of times people aren't necessarily prepared for that. Fear of Missing Out can double up the Forge triggers because you get a new combat step. Then you have, just like Final Vengeance is cheap removal. You have the Momentum Breakers. You have Clockwork Percussionist that could be card advantage. A lot of fodder to Torch Tower, and then Shieldred on the top end. Gix for kind of card advantage in the grindier matchups when Forge might not be reasonable. Braids, another way to kind of sack and get value out of things. Pyroclasm for the go wide decks, more cheap removal options, Graveyard Hate, and then Hand Hate for the more mid-range control decks. That is a lot, but good luck to everyone playing. Let me know what you do well with, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks for watching.